Good afternoon. I'm Bob Zimmer, President of the University of Chicago, and it is my privilege to welcome all of you here today to this memorial service to honor the life and work of Milton Friedman, the Paul Snowden Russell Distinguished Service Professor of Economics. We have with us today Mrs. Rose Friedman, Milton's wife of over 65 years, and their children, David Friedman and Janet Friedman Martell. Rose and Milton met in 1932 as students in Jacob Weiner's class in price theory, which met one block from here in the Social Sciences Building. Interspersed with travels elsewhere, they returned to Chicago in 1946 and remained for the next 30 years at the University of Chicago. They made their home in Hyde Park. David and Janet graduated from the laboratory schools on campus, and they made lifelong friendships with colleagues from across the university and in the Chicago community as a whole. While taking place here in Rockefeller Chapel at the university, this event is jointly convened by the University of Chicago and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. The speakers today include the President of the Czech Republic, Chicago economists, present and past, of extraordinary distinction, prominent leaders in commerce and thought who have made important contributions to economic growth and development. In addition, Leo Melamed, Chairman Emeritus of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and I will also read statements by others who could not be here today. Each of these persons has been profoundly influenced by the ideas and work of Milton Friedman. The joint convening of this event, as well as the collection of speakers, reflects, of course, upon Milton Friedman. He was an extraordinary scholar and intellectual leader at the university, and his ideas had a profound and lasting impact upon economic thought, governments on the domestic and international stage, and leaders in commerce within the United States and abroad. Others can and will speak with much greater authority than I on many of these matters, but I do want to reflect upon Milton Friedman's general approach to scholarship and why he represents in so many ways the very best of what the University of Chicago is and what we aspire to be every day. In autobiographical remarks, Milton wrote of his first experiences at the University of Chicago. Though 1932-33, my first year at Chicago, was financially my most difficult year, intellectually it opened new worlds. Jacob Weiner, Frank Knight, Henry Schultz, Lloyd Mintz, Henry Simons, and equally important, a brilliant group of graduate students from all over the world exposed me to a cosmopolitan and vibrant intellectual atmosphere of a kind I had never dreamed existed. I have never recovered. This is what Milton Friedman experienced with the University of Chicago. What the University of Chicago experienced with Milton Friedman was a brilliant analyst and fearless intellect who came to embody the university in many ways. First, he was a powerful thinker whose insights into his own discipline were profound, but whose work and approach had relevance far beyond his discipline's boundaries. It is very striking, even today, to read his essay on the methodology of positive economics, which I had recent occasion to do. This essay was written more than 50 years ago and was published in 1953 by the University of Chicago Press. In it, he lays out a perspective not just on economics, but articulates very powerfully the methodology and roles of theory and data, what they mean, with a very nuanced view of the nature of hypothesis, and how theory and data interact to create clarity and make predictions about phenomena one wishes to understand. The clarity and power of his arguments and analysis reflect upon Milton Friedman in several ways. They were a bold statement of an approach to economics. They contain a perspective of lasting importance regarding how one thinks about hypothesis and data, not only in economics, but in science and social science more generally, and they embody a set of general arguments and principles that can be applied to very specific situations and problems. While inevitably not without controversy, for me, there still remains a great deal for many of us to learn in reading this analysis. Second, he both benefited from and in turn helped recreate on a daily basis the defining culture of this university. Milton Friedman was renowned for unrelenting argument, bringing out the best in himself and others through his insistence on rigor and relentless argument in search of clarity. Status counted for nothing. Merit of argument counted for everything. He thereby changed economics through his argument-tested insights and his conviction and willingness to stand alone if necessary against commonly accepted paradigms. There is perhaps no one more identified with the value of intense and engaged argument than Milton Friedman, and no one more identified with a willingness to stand alone against common belief. And similarly, there is no university that holds these values as its core values as much as the University of Chicago. And in this respect, Milton Friedman and the University of Chicago were made for each other. Third, Milton Friedman believed in the power of ideas and their capacity to change the world for the better. This has been deeply etched in the university's culture since the founding vision of President William Rainey Harper. Milton Friedman, often hand in hand with Rose, argued tirelessly for the application of his ideas to enhance the quality of life of individuals and society. And in the combination of depth of scholarly impact, insight, and the impact of this insight on societies around the world, we again see no greater exemplar of the university's value and values than Milton Friedman. In 1998, Milton and Rose Friedman published a memoir entitled Two Lucky People. In it, they discuss the University of Chicago, quoting Milton and Rose. The University of Chicago is famous for its intense and stimulating intellectual atmosphere, concentration on ideas, intellectual discourse among equals judged by scholarly ability, not status, tolerance for unconventional ideas, interaction with scholars in different fields. These are the hallmarks of what we continue to regard as our university. And to Rose, I want to reply that because of Milton Friedman's work and impact, and because of how both of you represented and represent so much of what is extraordinary about our community, that the whole University of Chicago community will always regard this as your university as well. Near the end of his essay on methodology of positive economics, Milton Friedman comments upon the construction of new hypotheses, asking the question, where do they originate? And now I quote from this essay. On this problem, there is little to say on a formal level. The construction of hypotheses is a creative act of inspiration, intuition, invention. Its essence is the vision of something new in familiar material. And inspiration, intuition, invention, and the vision of something new in the familiar is, of course, exactly what all of us always saw in Milton Friedman. It's now my privilege to read a statement by the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who sends his regrets at not being able to attend today's service. From Mr. Greenspan. With so much having been written about Milton Friedman since his untimely death, I will limit myself to my first personal encounter, and secondly, my most vivid. I note that his death was untimely because there will never be a time when the world could afford it. My condolences to Rose, who may have been the only member of the human race to have intellectually stood up to Milton and prevailed. I delivered a paper on capital evaluation at an obscure meeting of the American Finance Association in 1959, which I thought Professor Friedman, whom I had never met, might find of interest. I certainly didn't expect a response. I was even more obscure than the American Finance Association. But he obviously read it and patiently outlined some suggestions for further study. Over the years, I was to learn that his response to me was part a reflection of his utter disregard for status. I have seen him speak with the same cadence and clarity to a high school student and the President of the United States. It was intellectual content, not rank, that engaged him. That was particularly evident when Milton took on General William Westmoreland on the issue of ending the draft during the hearing of the Commission on an all-volunteer armed force, on which in 1969 we both served. The poor general did not know what hit him. To say at that hour the pen was mightier than the sword would not do the exchange justice. The tour de force may also have been on the day that Milton turned Tom Gates, the chairman of the commission and former Secretary of Defense, to a staunch advocate of the all-volunteer force. I watched the process of Milton's quiet, rational advocacy for the end of the draft eventually lead to President Nixon's commission and the beginning of our nation's volunteer armed force in 1973. This nation will forever be in Milton's debt for the end of the involuntary servitude in the United States Armed Forces and his myriad other gifts to America. That concludes Mr. Greenspan's remarks. It's now my great honor to introduce our next speaker. There are few world leaders who have put the teachings of Milton Friedman into practice in such a striking way and in such an effective way as Czech Republic President Václav Klaus, as a political leader and reformer, and as Minister of Finance, Prime Minister, Speaker of the House, and now President of the Czech Republic. It is my great honor to introduce to you His Excellency President Václav Klaus.
Dear Rose, Mr. President, distinguished members of the University of Chicago faculty, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be with all of you here today, especially with Rose. Nevertheless, I am not sure I deserve to be privileged to be one of the speakers on this very special occasion, because I didn't have the chance to be a long-time colleague or a close personal friend of Milton Friedman. I was probably chosen to speak here on behalf of his admirers and pupils. I am proud to declare that I am one of them. For much of my life, which was spent in the communist era, I was just able to read about him, and what was more important, to read him. Very early, he became one of my heroes. I consider him to be one of the greatest thinkers and economists of the 20th century. However, I didn't dream that I would meet him or talk to him. When I had an opportunity to be in this country for the first time in the spring of 1969, I took a Greyhound tour across the United States and spent 24 hours in Chicago. I visited the university, walked around the campus, and tried to figure out where Milton Friedman could be. Just to be here in the vicinity of this great man was thrilling. I succeeded in seeing him personally for the first time after the collapse of communism, after the fall of the Iron Curtain. After those historic events, he directly or indirectly, but very substantially influenced. For us, who lived in the communist world, Milton Friedman was the greatest champion of freedom, of limited and unobtrusive government, and of free markets. Because of him, I became a true believer in the unrestricted market economy. One of my first political, worldwide quoted statements at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 1990, a few weeks after our Velvet Revolution, my statement was very Friedmanite. When describing the ambition to transform the country after 4 decades of communism, I said, I want to re-establish markets, but markets without adjectives. And the journalist immediately recognized that I am one of the Chicago boys. I helped them because I had a Chicago Graduate School of Business tie. Milton Friedman was the most influential economist of the 20th century. It's not my role to analyze his achievements in economic science. As a diligent student of economics, I try to follow the law of comparative advantages and know that at the University of Chicago, in front of his colleagues, I do not have the comparative advantage to speak about Milton's role and achievements in economic science. Milton was extremely important for us behind the Iron Curtain. It was unimaginable to meet him, as I said. It was impossible to get his Capitalism and Freedom. It was not easy to see his Newsweek columns, but it was possible to get the Journal of Political Economy and the American Economic Review in the public library, even in the darkest communist days. Some of us read such journals, and some of us understood that his contributions were more important than the writings of most of other economists. In the second half of the 1960s, during the so-called Prague Spring era, I wrote an article comparing Milton Friedman and John Kenneth Galbraith. I can assure you that already then my heart was fully on Milton's side. We should mention his theoretical works in the field of the theory of money, of the theory of the consumption function, his arguments for flexible exchange rates and for free trade, his ideas on the methodology of economic science, and his views on economic, especially monetary policy. His more general texts about freedom, about the relationship between the individual and the state, about markets and planning, about alternative economic systems were, of course, fundamental. The books Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose influenced millions of people all over the world. During my recent state visit to Mongolia, I was positively surprised to find the Mongolian translation of Free to Choose in a bookstore on the main street in the capital. We all admired him for the clarity of his thinking, as well as for his intellectual stubbornness, and at the same time for his personal kindness and charm. Nothing expresses his life better than the title of the book he wrote together with Rose, Two Lucky People. From what I know, I can confirm that they were lucky together, and I would add that we all were lucky to have had Milton Friedman. We are really missing him, and we all owe a lasting debt to him. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rose Friedman, Your Excellency, we received many letters. It is impossible to read them all, as Bob Zimmer said. So we've chosen just a couple. Here's one. I send greetings to those celebrating Milton Friedman Day. Milton Friedman, the 1976 Nobel Prize winner in economics, was an extraordinary economist, a revolutionary thinker, and one of America's greatest citizens. His brilliant mind and devotion to liberty helped advance human dignity and moral vision of a society built on human freedom. He proposed bold ideas about school choice, tax reductions, an all-volunteer army, and the role of the money supply in our economy. His innovation and intellect helped deliver economic stability and improve living standards in countries around the globe, and his work laid the foundation for many of America's most successful government reforms. Milton Friedman Day is an opportunity to honor the life and contributions of one of the most influential economists in history, and a time to remember freedom's incredible power to transform the world for the better. Our nation is grateful for the talents and determination of Milton Friedman. He will be remembered as a hero of freedom, and I appreciate all those who pay tribute to his legacy of liberty. Laura and I send our best wishes on this special occasion, George W. Bush. Although I did not know it at the time, my first introduction to Milton Friedman occurred in 1940, when I was but 7 years old. We were on the first leg of our escape from the Nazis at the outset of World War II and arrived from Białystok, the city of my birth, to Vilna. That's Vilnius, for those who don't know the Yiddish name of this venerable Lithuanian city. My father, who was first and foremost a mathematics teacher, sat me down to provide my first lesson in economics. Years later, I had the privilege of relating this story to Milton and Rose. In one hand, my father held up a Polish zloty. In the other, a Lithuanian lit. "Do you know what these are?" he asked. "Money," I answered, proud to show off my deep understanding of such things. "Yes," he agreed. "And do you know how much each of them is worth?" I shrugged my shoulders, having exhausted my expertise in high finance. My father then carefully explained that the value of those two units of currency could only be determined by what they can buy in the marketplace. What followed was my first exposure to the logic of Milton Friedman. I learned that while the official rate of exchange between the zloty and the lit was 1-for-1, in fact, it would take 2 zlotys to buy a loaf of bread, but only 1 lit. The government's official rate doesn't mean a thing, my father admonished. In the lessons of Milton Friedman in free market economics continued as we chased around the world and as the lit changed to a ruble, the ruble to a yen, and finally the yen to a dollar. It left an indelible impression, one that resonated some 30 years later when I became chairman of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. In 1970, the world was still chained to the failing fixed exchange rate regime agreed to in 1945 at Bretton Woods in the mountains of New Hampshire. Thereafter, foreign exchange trading was allowed only at the officially established rate of exchange. An individual, regardless of his standing, wealth, or business, was barred from participation. In a well-publicized story, when Milton Friedman attempted to go short the British pound, a bank refused him the right to do so on the basis that Friedman did not have the necessary commercial interest to deal in foreign exchange. As chairman of the CME, I was acutely aware that the idea of a futures market in currency, where everyone had sufficient commercial interest, was sheer heresy, akin to suggesting monotheism to a pagan. Knowledgeable people implored that the CME reject such a nonsensical idea. Most of our board of directors warned that futures markets were suited for traditional agricultural products and little else. The orthodox financial community was also vehemently opposed. At best, we were considered unwelcome and very distant relatives of the main line of the financial community. Futures markets, they predicted, would never be utilized for the sophisticated needs of world banks and commercial enterprises. Besides, Chicago was the wrong place. That was the habitat of Al Capone. Matters of finance belonged in the holy centers of finance, London and New York. It is nearly impossible today to understand or visualize the world before Milton Friedman's ideas revolutionized the planet and became orthodoxy. What is self-evident today was heretical then. Much of the world was still suffering the pains of command economics. The Iron Curtain was still intact. The Berlin Wall had not yet fallen. The dollar did not freely fluctuate. Free to choose had not yet become the roadmap for the international marketplace. There was another overriding issue which plagued me then. How could I, a lawyer turned trader cum financial innovator, really be certain that foreign currency instruments could succeed within the strictures designed for soybeans or eggs? Perhaps there was some fundamental economic reason why no one had before successfully applied financial instruments to futures. Indeed, on the eve of the currency launch, a prominent New York banker stated, quote, "It is ludicrous to think that foreign exchange can be entrusted to a bunch of pork-bellied crapshooters." Who could I turn to for advice? Who could overcome the weighty objections by so many? Who could give me courage to proceed? For me, there was but one person in the whole world capable of settling the issue. By 1970, I had become a committed and ardent disciple in the army that was forming around Milton Friedman's ideas. He had become our hero, our teacher, our mentor. I even had the temerity to sneak into his lectures at the UFC, although I wasn't a student, to listen to the great man expound on the free market. What I heard made my spirit soar. Here was the voice of supreme economic authority saying that the system of fixed exchange rates was wrong, that it was time for its demise. Here was the font of economic logic and vision saying that what I experienced as a child was true, that real value could only be determined by the free flow of supply and demand in an open, competitive marketplace. Perhaps I mused a marketplace like a futures market. Suddenly, the inevitable happened. The stresses resulting from the dysfunctional fixed exchange rate system was more than the U.S. could bear. On August 15, 1971, as we all know, President Nixon canceled the Bretton Woods Agreement and dropped the U.S. convertibility to gold. It was what Milton Friedman had advised Nixon to do from the beginning. For the world, it unleashed a financial tsunami whose reverberations would be felt a decade later. For me, it represented the moment of truth. We met for breakfast on Saturday, November 13th, 1971, at the New York Waldorf Astoria. I began by asking he promise not to laugh. At the time, I had no understanding of what Alan Greenspan has described as Milton Friedman's utter disregard for status. I held my breath as I put forth the idea of a futures market in foreign currency. The great man did not hesitate. "It's a wonderful idea," he said emphatically. "You must do it." Elated, I pursued, "Is there any reason foreign currency might not work in a futures market?" "None I can think of," he replied. For a moment, his words hung in the air. When my voice returned, I said, "No one will believe me that you said that." Milton chuckled. "Sure they will." "No," I boldly said, "I need it in writing." He smiled. "Are you suggesting that I write a paper on the need for a futures currency market?" I nodded. "You know I'm a capitalist," Milton ventured. We shook hands and settled on an amount of $7,500 for a feasibility study on the need for a futures market in currency. A friendship and bond was formed that lasted a lifetime. Within a month, I held in my hand the holy grail for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. The most influential economic mind of the 20th century provided the CME with the intellectual foundation upon which to build its financial futures superstructure. He said all he needed to in 11 pages. The rest, as they say, is history. On May 16, 1972, the IMM, the financial division established by the CME, ushered in the modern era of financial derivatives. Coincidentally, the following year, the Black-Scholes model provided the foundation for exchange-traded equity options. Both events occurred in Chicago. During the first decade of its existence, the IMM initiated a series of innovations in foreign exchange, interest rates, and equity indices. In 1986, precisely 14 years after its inception, Nobel laureate in economics Merton H. Miller declared financial futures as, quote, the most significant financial innovation of the last 20 years. Sure, we were lucky. Sure, our timing was great. Sure, the idea was invincible. But the major difference was the paper written by Milton Friedman. It was the equivalent to an unvanquishable secret weapon. With it in hand, with often Burl Sprinkle at my side, who's sitting here today, we crisscrossed the nation innumerable times, visited every nation on the planet, addressed audiences large and small, faced government officials, bank presidents, corporate treasurers, and the brokerage community, and convinced them that a market in currency futures, a market in financial instruments, was an idea whose time had come. It was magical. For when we said the IMM was a great idea, the world yawned or laughed. When we told them Milton Friedman said so, the world took notice. When we were told fixed exchange were coming back, we responded, Friedman said they're not. When we were told Chicago is the wrong place, we responded, Friedman is a Chicagoan. When we were told we were crazy, we responded, Friedman is one of us. And each and every time, his name made the difference. Throughout the years, this magic escalated. As his capitalism and freedom became the watchword for economic philosophy, as his logic on behalf of individual choice, free markets, and personal responsibility gained adherence, as his beliefs in individual liberty infused freedom around the globe, his name assumed near mystical proportions. Presidents, finance ministers, central bankers, businessmen who would otherwise not have given us the time of day or allowed us near their door, because of his name, opened the door for us. In the winter of 1975, Alan Greenspan instantly embraced our next iteration, Treasury bill futures. He had read Friedman's currency paper. When the CFTC required U.S. Treasury approval for our T-bill contract, at my behest, Milton Friedman telephoned William Simon, the Secretary of Treasury. Our contract was approved the same day. Milton Friedman rang the opening bell of this contract in January of 1976. But perhaps the reaction of George F. Shultz is emblematic of the value of Milton Friedman's paper and tells the whole story. Shultz was the first American government official I visited after the launch of the IMM's currency market. He had just been appointed Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary Shultz had no way of knowing that this was my first visit to Washington, D.C., or that my knees were shaking as I entered his imposing office. Wisely, I had sent Milton's feasibility paper to the Secretary before I arrived. There was very little conversation between us. Shultz listened to my explanation, smiled, and with a wave of his hand said, "Listen, Mr. Melamed, if it's good enough for Milton, it's good enough for me. Thank you."
I was very lucky to be a member of one of the first U of C cohorts that took price theory from Milton Friedman. Fortune later put us together as colleagues at Chicago for 53 years, if you count Emeritus status, and for some 30 if you just count the years of active service. And as if to prove that fortune doesn't always smile, she also led us to share what Milton has called some, quote, trials and tribulations, end quote, arising mainly out of a brief visit that Milton paid to Chile in March of '75. These experiences gave me lots of exposure to Milton, in good weather and bad, and imparted to me what I think is a good sense of Milton Friedman, the person. Clearly, this person was always and inexorably an economist, but there are other vital traits that transcend professional matters. It is these other traits that led me to choose my theme for today. No frills, no pettiness, no fear. I used this theme in a presentation almost 10 years ago as we celebrated the launching of Milton and Rose's Two Lucky People. No other path rivaled this one as a theme for today, for I felt this captured so much, though of course not nearly all, of the essence of Milton as a person. I'm totally certain that these elements, no frills, no pettiness, no fear, would be his abiding traits no matter what profession he might have chosen. Most importantly, they're traits that I deeply admire, and I hope I have learned from, side by side with all that I've garnered from his teaching and his writings. No frills. Here I have to start with the wonderful, or even better put, beautiful, 2-quarter course in price theory that I took from Milton. Luckily, the essence of that course was enshrined in Milton's book, Price Theory, so it's available for one and all to explore and appreciate. To me, that course was like the proverbial three-legged stool. Every part was essential. Nothing could be thrown away without disturbing the integrity of the whole. Nothing in it was pompous, nothing pretentious, nothing prissy. In Two Lucky People, Friedman marvels at the aesthetic quality of price theory, saying it always reminded him of Keats's famous "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." That certainly resonates with what I got out of my exposure to Milton in that price theory sequence. It was as if he didn't want you to learn price theory, but to imbibe it, to make it part of yourself. That course, more than any other, formed my vision of economics as a discipline, of my own role within it, and of how and what I ought to teach my students. I think of myself as a sort of old-fashioned carpenter or tinker or jack of all trades, wandering around with a simple but highly reliable kit of tools, ready to take on just about any problem that comes along, feeling confident most of the time as familiar scenarios come up again and again, but feeling genuinely challenged when something really unexpected appears, and totally exhilarated when a way is found to get that old toolkit to outdo itself in handling one of these skullcrackers. I think that this spirit, this attitude, this view of the world is the clearest distinguishing feature of a whole generation of Chicago economists who went out to make their way in the real world. I think this is a big part of the reason why so many of them rose to the top, dealt successfully with so many problems, and in the end probably influenced the course of history. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the seeds of this spirit and attitude are to be found in Milton's price theory course. Now, no pettiness. It stuns me every time I realize that my contacts with Milton Friedman go back by now some 60 years. But what's even more amazing is that in all that time, in all our contacts, even in all my reading of his writings and watching of his tapes, I have never once been aware of his making use of an argumentum ad hominem or fighting an intellectual battle with weapons of insinuation and innuendo, or even telling others that they should believe his line of reasoning because Adam Smith or Alfred Marshall or some other great man also held that view. It is as if an iron will kept driving him to talk about the merits of the case, and only about the merits of the case all the time. Frankly, I don't think that Milton ever even felt the temptation to use the snide remark or the frivolous quip to put down an adversary. It's as if he had totally purged his mind of such thoughts. But there is more to it than just Milton's strength of character. Milton, in effect, told his students, it doesn't matter who said what. What matters is what's right. Hence, you'll never find in any Friedman exam, or for that matter, in any of mine, or in any of a host of other Friedman students, questions of a who said what nature. What you'll find are questions that make you think, that assess how well you have internalized the essence of our science and discipline, that test how well you handle our basic kit of tools. Before leaving the no pettiness theme, I have to stop to comment on our trials and tribulations. The short visit that Milton and Rose paid to Chile in 1975 came at the invitation of a private foundation affiliated with a major Chilean bank, then headed by Ralph Luders, one of our alumni. I was the key intermediary in bringing about that visit. Now, with all the trouble that erupted afterwards, with all the unjust and ill-founded criticism to which Milton was subject, with all the past relationships and friendships that were shaken as a result of that visit, one might think it only natural for Milton to have borne a certain resentment, if not a grudge or worse, against Ralph Luders and me. Nothing of the kind. Never in the whole unhappy and protracted sequel to that Chile visit did I sense even the slightest crack in the bonds that linked us. Quite the contrary, it seemed that with each new assault, those bonds grew firmer and stronger. What did disappoint both Milton and me were those who, spurred by the passions of the moment, took positions against us and what we allegedly had done, without their having any idea of what actually happened, what we really said, or in what spirit we said it. We were also puzzled about how the many dozens of established economists who had been actually contracted for long periods of time by authoritarian regimes in Brazil, Korea, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Philippines, Taiwan, Yugoslavia, among others, how those economists somehow escaped the same opprobrium. I was dismayed, too, by the way Milton was picked on, especially in light of the fact that in the barely 7 days he spent in Chile, he gave several lectures extolling political as well as economic freedom and expressing his faith that authoritarian rule cannot long survive once economic liberty prevails. No fear. Of the three traits in my title, this is the one that even observers from afar should see and appreciate. There seemed to be some inner force within Milton, driving him to tell the truth as he saw it, come what may. This is what he did in his lectures and seminars in Chile. Having told the truth as he saw it, he could never cave in to his attackers. To yield on these matters would not for him signal a change of view. It would be nothing less than a denial of his true self. He was expressing an essential part of his nature as he stood his ground and took whatever came during his trials and tribulations. But Milton was fearless long before that episode. Societies have subtle and not so subtle ways of promoting and enforcing conformity. And this is true not only of Catholic Spain, Victorian England, and Bible Belt America. It tends to be true of establishment views no matter where. Maybe political correctness is its current manifestation in American universities. Well, we also have waves of economic correctness within our profession. In my lifetime, none was stronger than the Keynesian wave that swept through the profession in the 1940s and 1950s. To be sure, there were many dissenters to this wave. There was lots of grumbling and complaining in quiet conclaves. But there were few who marched out in front, making public targets of themselves as they stated their dissenting views. And of these, Milton was without doubt the first and foremost. Milton stood firm throughout his long and lonely vigil as the main prophet of monetarism in a Keynesian world. If that role were an easy one to play, the list of prophets would be a lot longer. But it was not at all easy. It meant isolating oneself from much of the economics profession. It meant being thought of, referred to, and often treated as an oddball or a crank. I truly believe that this is the way it all would have ended had Milton not, in addition to being courageous, been so profoundly right and so forthrightly persuasive in presenting his evidence and his case. I think it's fair to say that this particular stage or siege had been surmounted by the time Milton received his Nobel Prize in '76. But as any reader of Milton's Newsweek columns or of his and Rose's Capitalism and Freedom or Free to Choose knows, one can easily build an extensive list of issues on which he and Rose made themselves vulnerable, as they say. Of these, the legalization of drugs was perhaps the most daring. The volunteer army was the one that produced the quickest and most resounding victory. But I want to dwell for a moment on the educational voucher scheme, for it reveals an underpublicized and underappreciated aspect of the Friedman's thinking. Let me simply quote from two lucky people. The tendency for our society to become increasingly stratified, to simplify, the skilled and highly schooled versus the unskilled and poorly schooled have-nots, this threatens the social stability of society. Radical improvement in the quality of schooling is the only major force that seems currently available to offset this tendency. And still quoting, the more we have learned about our educational system, the greater has become our confidence that an unrestricted voucher system would lead to an enormous improvement in the schooling available to our children, especially to those in the most disadvantaged families. As I read the record, Milton and Rose are here grappling with one of the deepest problems of any society, providing hope and motivation for those in the lower socioeconomic strata. The truth that they espouse, which is one that I can attest to based on more than half a century of work and observation in developing countries, is that true opportunity for one's children is a wonderful form of glue to hold a society together and a powerful vaccine against social discontent and unrest. Market economy, genuine opportunity, and advancement based on merit in a competitive setting, these elements reinforce each other. Together, they give us the best prescription for the future of a free economy in a free society. We are grateful for all you have given us, Milton. The world, and most especially our world here at the U of C, will just not be the same without you.
It is a great privilege for me to be in this audience, this memorial today with this distinguished company in remembrance of my friend, Professor Milton Friedman, who generously mentored me and the Fraser Institute. For most people in the world, the very best way to remember Milton is simply to look around. From Mongolia to Manitoba, from Reykjavik to Cape Town, from Sydney to Beijing, and in every nook and cranny of the former Soviet Union, the ideas of Milton Friedman inform and enthuse the economic policies that are transforming the world and eradicating poverty at an unprecedented rate. Free to Choose, the book written by Milton and his brilliant wife Rose, has been the handbook for reformers and national leaders in dozens of languages. You really can't think about Milton without thinking about Rose. Rose, who has been the enabler, the critic, the instigator, the radical, and the moderator of their very joint effort to change the world. Rose, who has made everyone more relaxed in approaching what was undoubtedly one of the greatest intellects in the history of the human race. The last time I was with Milton, 2 weeks before his death, he was then as he always had been, curious, cheerful, combative, and of course resolute. The occasion was a meeting regarding the Milton and Rose D. Friedman Foundation, of which I am privileged to be a director. The business of the foundation was dealt with efficiently and well, but its conduct did not preclude us from having in passing a debate about the merits of naked short selling. The discussion reminded me that one of Milton's contributions to the world was his important 1971 paper, which Leo, the creator of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, has noted was crucial in creating the world's largest financial and futures market. How appropriate that Leo is here today. Milton Friedman was a polymath. Students of statistics first encounter him when they calculate an F-test for ranked data. Economics students recognize him for his original contributions to most of the theoretical underpinnings of both macro and microeconomics, from the theory of capital to the functioning of exchange rates, and of course the understanding of how consumption behavior and the demand for cash balances interact to spread monetary shocks through the economy. Central bankers pay him homage daily as they monitor the inflation rate as an indicator of monetary policy. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Milton's monetarist mantra was not always the touchstone of monetary policy. In fact, many, such as Canadian economist John Kenneth Galbraith, believe that inflation was caused by wage and other cost pressures, and the cure was wage and price controls. Now, while Ken and Milton were friendly acquaintances during the 1970s, that is no surprise, since Milton was friendly to everybody, both the many who opposed his ideas and the few who embraced them. That is how he survived for 30 years while the world was foolishly imbibing socialist ideas. While people may not have agreed with him, they had to admit he was a nice guy. The only people who had anything to fear were those who came to his money workshop with half-baked ideas, particularly ones which had already been discussed in a previous paper. One of his most endearing characteristics of this gentle intellectual giant was his humanity. His concern not to embarrass the askers of silly questions. And just think of how many he may have encountered in his career. His care to treat every person with respect, even when they assailed him for his views. A great tennis player. Until he was in his mid-80s, he was also a good skier. And he once sheepishly admitted to me he'd like to learn inline skating. But he also did handwriting analysis as a parlor trick and an icebreaker to make others feel comfortable in social settings. And a surprise to many, he was a very competent woodworker who built much of the family furniture in the early days, a hobby he shared with Frank Knight. Milton's contributions to economic understanding were driven by his ambition to change the world. He was a student of history as well as a creator of it, and acutely aware of the extent to which human suffering and underachievement were the unintended consequences of well-meaning but incorrect policy. Perhaps that explained his tolerance. But as early as the early 1950s, he was lecturing about connections between human achievement and economic freedom. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, was an early statement of what was to become the comprehensive worldview of libertarian economists. Milton, by the way, used to refer to the Capitalism and Freedom as the Old Testament, whereas Free to Choose was the New Testament. While it was the Old Testament that led Milton and Rose and me to initiate in 1984 the process that created the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is now released annually in more than 70 countries and has inspired intra-country indices in China, India, the Arab world, North America, Europe, and Argentina. While Milton and Rose have often been described as advocates of a free market, they were first investigators of how economic process worked. They wanted to know how markets for education and health care worked, and that led them to favor vouchers and certification to ensure the effective delivery of these crucial services. Their support for educational choice through vouchers is currently expressed in the activities of the Milton and Rose D. Friedman Foundation. Now, while Milton would surely reject the use of the term, national leaders from Premier Zhao Ziyang in China to Prime Minister David Odson in Iceland would testify that Milton was a great missionary. He made many excursions to Canada to convert the northern socialists. His first with Rose in 1940 was nearly his last, as the convertible car in which they were traveling rolled off the highway between Banff and Jasper, Alberta. What a terrible burden that Canada would have had to bear if this had turned out otherwise. In 1982, a trip with Rose to meet with then Premier Bill Bennett helped to produce a dramatic program of economic reform comparable to the performances by Roger Douglas in New Zealand and Mrs. Thatcher in the UK. During his last trip just over a year ago, he was mobbed like a rock star by young people wanting his autograph. But you know, in a curious way, we will not miss Milton Friedman. We'll not miss him because he is ever present in the ideas and policies which surround us. In fact, it is difficult to avoid him. For those engaged in the study and impact of ideas, he will always be our companion, encouraging us to be bold in our defense of economic freedom, counseling us to be tolerant of those who have not yet had the gift of understanding, urging us to spread the word about the great power of markets and the unintended consequences which result from ignoring or attempting to subvert the inexorable force of incentives on behavior. But I shall miss him nonetheless. I shall miss his sage counsel which he happily gave. I shall miss his encouragement and enthusiasm which knew no bounds. I shall miss his effervescent optimism, which was as reassuring as it was infectious. But most of all, I shall miss our conversations about economic issues, from which I always learned something new, and which I always felt privileged to be included. Thank you, Milton, for all that you gave to us and to the countless generations not yet born who will benefit from your wisdom and your teachings.
Rose, Janet, David, President Klaus, ladies and gentlemen. I first met Milton Friedman more than 50 years ago when I came to the University of Chicago as a graduate student. That lucky decision changed my life. I came to Chicago believing that I knew a fair bit of economics. And so when I went to the first day of class of the course on price theory that Harberger mentioned, I went with some skepticism. I wasn't sure whether I really had to take that course. I'd also heard him give a lecture at Princeton on flexible exchange rates that were discussed by Leo in detail. But I came away from that lecture thinking it was so simple, it couldn't be right. I associated complexity with depth. So I came to the class, and he asked the question after about 15 or 20 minutes, and I shot up my hand, gave an answer, and I, to this day, remember exactly what he said. He said, "That's no answer. That's restating the question in other words." Well, as soon as he said it, I knew he was right. In fact, I knew before he said it that it was no answer. So I sat down, listened to the lecture, and I reflected, and I felt, again, I was lucky. I reflected, I really had to relearn economics from the ground up. That one lecture convinced me of that. And so I attended every lecture that he gave with tremendous excitement. And I've heard from others. Harberger mentioned it. Bob Lucas has mentioned that to me. Sherwin Rosen has mentioned it. Gene Fama. The excitement we felt at attending those classes. And I devoted essentially the next 6 years studying economics at Milton's feet. There were other experiences I had as a graduate student that left a lasting impression on me. I remember when I had a couple of ideas about a dissertation on racial discrimination, not a conventional subject at the time, but Milton's variety of topics that he discussed in the price theory class and in other discussions when I was fortunate to have an encounter with him, emboldened me to feel, well, maybe we could apply it to some other areas like discrimination. So I sent a draft of a first 5 or 6 pages to him, and Rose and Milton and Janet and David were then in Cambridge, England. So it took a while. You didn't have email at those days. It took a while, over a month, before I got an answer. I'd looked every day, and finally I saw this envelope, Milton Friedman. So I ripped it open, and then my dismay just grew. It was ripping me from one end to the other. As I read it over, this is, what does this mean? This is no sentence. I can't understand what you're saying. This doesn't make any sense to me. I was thinking, gee, I have to look for another topic. Finally, the very end, he said, but there are a couple of good ideas in here, and I think it's worth developing as a thesis. Well, I put that away. I couldn't come back to the topic for 2 or 3 weeks. Finally, I did. And his last couple of sentences, if he hadn't added that, I would have changed the topic. The third important memory I had was the last 3 years of these 6 years, I was an assistant professor in the department, and half my time was supposed to be devoted to helping Milton run the money workshop. And I would do a lot of the things that he didn't have time to do, like meet with some of the students he didn't want to be bothered with. And one day we went downtown to buy some used Marchant and Monroe calculators. There were no, obviously, PCs or computers in those days. This is what we had to deal with. We brought them back and we put them in the basement where the graduate students working on money could have access to them. The workshop was an enormous innovation. It was very intense. Originally, actually, it met twice a week. Papers had to be read in advance. The speaker had no opportunity to present his paper. He could only introduce it, and then discussion took over. And for me and for the other participants, and there were many faculty and students, the main purpose was to hear Milton's comments on all the different papers. And he would attack, well-mannered, but he would attack vigorously. He would also offer valuable suggestions how to improve it. So it was no contest with somebody set up there to be destroyed. The purpose was intellectual barnstorming. And sometimes the discussion got so intense that we had to remind the speaker that he shouldn't butt in too much. That the goal was to hear the discussion, and he was merely a catalyst for that discussion. What I learned from him above all else, and I think the other students who went through Chicago would have similar reflections, that economics was something serious. This was not a game to be played by clever academics. This was valuable analysis that helped us understand many aspects of the real world. He had no interest in theory for its own sake, but for him, theory was an engine analysis, a phrase he liked to use that he said he got from Alfred Marshall, but he used it over and over again, an engine of analysis to understand real-world problems. This intimate relation between theory and the real world was not common at that time. And sometimes it's not common even to this day. But it had an enormous influence on all of us who went to Chicago and ultimately on the profession. He practiced what he preached in his own writings. I consider his book, Theory of the Consumption Function, his most impressive, innovative, and complete contribution to the science of economics. It actually was stimulated in good part by an earlier paper by Rose and Dorothy Brady on consumption. And Milton built on that paper in a variety of different ways. The book assaulted an aspect of Keynesian economics on the relationship between consumption and income. But it was much more than that. It was an impressive, and at that time I would say unprecedented, combination of basic, simple economic theory, not very complicated, but insightful. Extensive analysis of a variety of data, not just one piece of data, but data from all aspects of consumption. And that combined with care in how he related the data to the theory. That threefold combination was a tour de force, and a great book to this day, recognized as a great book. It went into Keynesian consumption-income relations, but a great deal of detail. Do blacks save more than whites? It was thought to be so, but he showed it was simply a misunderstanding of what income drove people's behavior. Do urban and rural people differ? Not really, he said. Do occupations differ? Reading that book was reading science, economic science, as his highest level. Now, Milton believed that in order to prescribe, to advise what government should do, one had to first understand how markets actually behaved, including how participants responded to different incentives created by taxes, regulations, economic growth, you name it. Now, once he understood it, he clearly was not shy of suggesting ways to improve the world. And for many people, that's what he's mainly known for, although economists know him for that, but also in important ways for scientific contributions. He had the classical liberals' confidence in the capacity of individuals to make their own decisions, to promote their own interests and desires more effectively than governments or intellectuals could do. That was a foundation of all his public policy work. Now, many people who claim to speak for the people often, in fact, have little confidence in that people can make their decisions. He had that confidence. He is best known to the general public for his unwavering support of economic freedom, free markets, and competition. His views partly spread through his enormously influential book, With Rose, Free to Choose. But I consider his most important book on public policy his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, also written with Rose, virtually ignored when it first came out at that year. It contains almost all his well-known proposals on public policy. And think of that, in 1957, Theory of the Consumption Function, 62, Capitalism and Freedom, and 63, the Monetary History. So in 6 years, 3 of his major contributions to economics, 2 of them with Rose. Now, Capitalism and Freedom includes endless number of proposals. I went back and read this about a year ago when I was giving a talk in honor of Rose and Milton in San Francisco. And I had forgotten, I must say, how many things are in Capitalism and Freedom. The vouchers that we've heard about, written in the early 50s, part of Capitalism and Freedom. Privatizing Social Security. Al told us about the Chilean experience. Now, when Chile introduced Social Security in 1981, I'd never really, until I reread Capitalism and Freedom, associated that with Milton Friedman. It has ideas consistent, individual accounts and so on, consistent with his ideas. But I went back and I was reading the book, and there I see the whole system is laid out. Actually better than it was implemented in Chile. I mean, details, how it could operate and so on. A remarkable piece. Flat tax. He suggests that a flat tax of about 20% could replace this complicated tax structure we had at that time. Now, again, I'd forgotten, and it's hard to believe, but the top income tax rate then was 91%. 91%. And he said, well, you can throw that out and replace it with 20%, approximately 20%. I mean, it was an eye-opener. And the world has moved a lot in that direction, not toward exactly a flat tax, but a much flatter tax structure. And that's all parts of the world, Scandinavia, Europe, Eastern, Western Europe, the United States, Asia, have all moved in flattening the tax. And Milton was there over 45 years ago with a clear statement of how it could be done and how it could save resources. Of course, it also contains the advocacy of flexible exchange rates. Now, at that point, I could better appreciate the power of that essay. My youthful ignorance, I hope I'd overcome it to some extent. Discuss the significance of economic freedom to political freedom. That was a very deep, and I heard him lecture on that when I was a graduate student, and how the necessity of having economic freedom to produce political freedom. Not the sufficiency, but the necessity. I thought that was a very profound and lasting insight. Voluntary army. We've heard the discussion, Alan Greenspan's letter. In the book, very briefly in the book, but mentioned in the book as well. And negative income tax, I mean, I just scratched the surface of some of the important ideas expressed in that book. A couple of years after the book was published, Milton and Rose came to spend a year at Columbia University, and I was a professor then at Columbia. And it was great having them both there, but Milton spent a considerable amount of his time then debating the whole of the city. Why? Well, this was the 1964 campaign for president, and he was the chief economic advisor to Barry Goldwater. And Milton would be having one discussion one day and another day. And I said to him, don't you find it difficult when you're basically at odds with the whole city? He said, no. Actually, it's pretty simple and easy, because people in this city have never heard a well-articulated view for markets and so-called conservatism. So they're simple. They're pushovers. And knowing Milton as a debater, I'm sure he more than held his own, as I noticed. As others have said, but I'll repeat, some of the things definitely stand repetition. He had a missionary zeal to convert the heathen, no matter how unimportant to the world were their opinions. And I've seen him sit explaining to taxi drivers why their statements about taxes made no sense while the meter was running up his fare. My wife Geety and I drove with Milton and Rose each year to a gathering arranged by George Schultz in Monterey, California. We drive from Northern California. I drove since we had little confidence in Milton's driving. Now, Mike, you mentioned that experience in Canada. I know Rose may disagree with me, but Geety and I certainly had little confidence, I would say. And he would be sitting next to me, and we'd be so embroiled in different discussions. And he would be talking about this issue, and I'd be trying to respond and drive at the same time. Then inevitably, we missed the exits. Finally, after a while, Rose or Geety would speak, but didn't we pass that exit 10 miles ago that we were supposed to take? And sure enough, in the last year, last February, again, we missed our exit. We had to turn around and try to find it. Of course, I was a graduate student, as I mentioned, but in a fundamental sense, I always remained his student. Eventually, I became a colleague, and I like to believe a good friend. I was impressed from the very beginning by his brilliance as a teacher and a researcher. He was an idea machine, as reflected in his own work and his influence over the works of others. I mean, how many students of us at Chicago had our work greatly influenced by him, as well as people who wrote to him or read his stuff? I mean, he had idea after idea. But I also became impressed later on by his less obvious qualities, at least less obvious to a graduate student. His sterling character, as it was mentioned. He would never soften his view to curry favor, never once, in my knowledge. His perennial optimism. It was very hard to see Milton down. Occasionally, when there was some real crisis in the world, maybe, but perennial optimism. I spoke to him 3 days before his unfortunate death. And he had been just out of the hospital. And I said, Milton, how are you doing? And he said, well, I hope well. And he went on from that and asked me how I was doing and what was new, and we discussed a couple of ideas to boot at the time. His loyalty to those he liked and fairness toward those he disagreed with. His love of a good argument without resorting, as we've heard, to personal attacks on his opponents. And his courage in the face of prolonged and virulent attacks on him by others, not only because of the Chilean matter, but his intellectual ideas. He was ridiculed for decades by economics professionals and the public media. He maintained his courage and devotion to science and public policy. He was an intellectual giant with a personality and temperament to match. Milton Friedman will be sorely missed. Now, one announcement. It's customary for the audience to remain seated while the family and the guests leave first. So thank you for following that.